Hey guys, this is Corey from Redefining Strength. Welcome to the Fitness Hacks Podcast. This is the show where I share all my free workout and nutrition tips. I'm not going to ever fill this episode with sponsorships or ask you to buy anything. All I ask in return is if you're enjoying the podcast to leave a review or leave a 5-star rating. Or even better, share it with someone you think it might help. This will only take a few minutes and would mean the world to me and possibly change the life of someone you know. So let's jump right in. So you want to see better fat loss results. Well, the sad fact of the matter is we can't out-exercise or out-diet time, which means that trying to do more, as good as that action feels, won't actually yield better results faster. However, we can make tweaks to our diet and our workout routine that help us really dial things in a way that produces more quality habits and can help us see results faster. And I want to focus on those fundamentals. Because going back to those boring basics and realizing that it is those boring things, those tedious things done daily, the unsexy things that really add up to the sexy results is super important. And the more we hone in, the more precise we get with it, the more we really want to learn about those basics and perfect them, the better off we're going to be. So the first tip I wanted to go over was about not demonizing carbs or fats, but actually cycling ratios that are higher carb or higher fat back to back. Often we do get into saying fats make you fat or carbs are bad, they make you gain belly fat, but neither macro is evil and both have their purpose. And while yes, if you're more active doing more cardio, you might tend to be in the higher carb ratio area versus if you're less active, maybe going through menopause, you tend to go with higher fats. Actually, cycling ratios that vary back to back can be really key, especially when we are trying to lose that last little bit of stubborn fat. And the reason for this is because it gives us different sources of energy and it actually impacts our body in different ways. We often see lower carb ratios with higher fat because we're then depleting glycogen stores, which can help us tap into stored fat to use that fat as energy. But we also want to think about increasing our carbs after a period of being low carb. Often when you've been low carb, you might notice that you've lost some weight, you've lost some fat, but you look a little bit squishier. And this can be because our fat cells are storing water. When we then increase our carb intake, we can actually find that our fat cells release this water, which is why when you've gone higher carb after a lower carb period, they call it the whoosh effect, but you can see that loss of water weight that has been stored in the fat cells. The fat cells feel safe to sort of release that because they have more fuel coming in, that readily available energy. So cycling higher carb after lower carb can be beneficial to help you see that fat loss. It's giving you a different energy source. And if you can even time your workouts to change to maybe a little bit more cardio, a little bit more intensive when you do this, that's even more beneficial. Maybe you add in a little extra walking. But don't fear carbs just because you even sometimes do see that spike on the scale, because with that spike on the scale right after, as your body adapts, because your glycogen stores are now full from being depleted after being low carb, you can see that whoosh effect losing that water weight. So it can come sometimes with a little increase on the scale, but then also that loss and you looking leaner. And then after that, you might go back to a lower carb ratio. But don't be afraid to cycle every couple weeks a higher or lower carb ratio, higher or lower fat ratio. Because also with cycling those things, we're keeping hormonal balance while focusing on our protein being higher to protect our lean muscle mass, preserve all those bodily processes, help us even have that higher thermic effect to help with fat loss. But cycle carbs and fat, don't just demonize them. And if you do find you run better off of lower carb or higher carb, you can still stay in that lower or higher range, just slightly cycling up in it or down in it. But don't fear occasionally adding in a ratio that's vastly different from what you're doing if you are trying to lose that last little bit. Then realize, this is tip number 2, realize that boring is your best friend. I brought it up already, but those boring basics done daily are really what yield sexy results. I know it's very tempting and I find myself doing it even though I know better too. Searching for something new, searching for something that's going to be like that aha moment. I have people come into programs and be like, oh, I knew all this. Yeah, well, guess what? If something says something that you really didn't know at all, instead of just saying something in a slightly different way that clicks, it's probably a fad diet or quick fix that isn't going to be lasting changes, or it's, I'm sorry to say, slightly BS. And I'm not saying that there aren't new things we're learning, but a lot of times we're searching for this aha moment that will make it seem like everything's super easy and going to happen overnight. And anything that promises that isn't promising real results. Those boring basics do daily are what add up. If you think about, through school learning things, if you think about anything you've learned, it's always been boring things that you sort of have to do daily to really ingrain and learn that new pattern to be able to see the results that you want. Same thing goes for our aesthetic goals, our performance goals. You have to put in the work in the gym. You have to put in the work in terms of fueling. You have to put in the work in terms of your recovery. But it's those boring basics done daily. And the more we seek to try and make things fun or exciting, the more we might be sabotaging ourselves, getting fancy where we don't need to be. And that's where we start to feel like the effort doesn't equal the outcome because we're putting in a lot more effort, often wasting time with things that are fancier than they need to be over keeping things basic. So if you've been given something with it's a basic ratio, or even you're like, oh, well, you're just telling me to focus on protein. Well, that's maybe where you need to focus first before you even worry about carbs and fat. Don't get distracted by other things. Focus on that boring basic until you get super, uber, duper consistent and precise with it, and then you can add on. But the more we return to those basics and perfect them, the better our results are going to be. Then number 3, don't try to out quantity quality. And what I mean by this is a lot of times we think about adding on more before going back to being more intentional or getting more out of the moves we're already doing or the things we're already doing. And I especially see this with workouts where people will be like, oh, I want better results, so I'm going to add on more reps or add on more moves or add on another workout or add on more time. Instead of saying, hey, this is the time I have. This is the time allotted. These are the reps that are assigned. How can I get more out of them? Because a lot of times we could lift a little bit more weight. We could try a little bit more advanced variation. We could be a little bit more intentional with movement. There's a lot more quality we can get out of what we're already doing. And I even bring this up with macro ratios where people will be like, well, I want a new macro ratio or I want to do something new with diet. And I'm like, but you were 4% off or 5% off in your ratios over the week. Why not be 2% off? The more we can dial in what we're currently doing, the more we can really test out what's working, but also not have to work harder to some extent, not have to be seeking something new. We can dial in those basics so much better and get so much more quality out of the quantity we're already doing, which honestly saves us a lot of time, which a lot of us use that excuse. I don't have enough time. And it also saves us on a lot of effort because often in adding on more, we're expending a lot more effort. And then it feels like the effort doesn't equal the outcome. We feel like we're really working too hard to not see the results that we want. And we also create a lot more pain and change. When we're trying to do all these new things, all these different things, we create a lot of pain and a lot of resistance. And it feels like we're relying on a lot of willpower to do all these different things over anything becoming disciplined. But the less we do, the more intentional we are with it, the easier it is to have those things become true habits and routines and become disciplined with them so that we aren't relying on willpower. So when things get busy, we feel like we can still maintain those habits more easily and even be more precise in them. And then we also see it easier to add on other changes that we do need to make because those things have become so ingrained and we're not relying on willpower so much. Then number 4, embrace you won't always be motivated and realize that even then you need to be consistent. And this sort of goes back to the quality, not quantity thing, where you want to focus on what's the minimum I can do to see results. Think about how often you approach things being like, I have to make all these changes at once, and then you feel overwhelmed and you think things are too hard. I know I've done that. But instead, if we approach something as like, what's the minimum I can do to see results? It's a lot easier. And that allows you to get a lot more consistent. I often show this as like the habit stacking with boxes, where if you're stepping up onto a low box versus trying to jump onto that highest box right away, it's a lot easier. Stepping up to a box you can hit, you're like, okay, I can do that. Jumping up onto a box, you're like, oh, I don't know if I can hit that. It's a lot more intimidating, a lot more overwhelming. It might even hold you back from trying it in the first place because you're worried about getting injured. Versus the other box, you're like, well, I can do this. We have to treat our habits the same way. Think about what can I step up onto? Like, what's a habit that's so easy I can repeat it in my sleep? Do that one thing first. And once you're doing that, you're like, okay, I'm willing to step up to the next box. You want to encourage yourself with that success mindset to want to build more and more. And that's where we have to think about, okay, if I'm not motivated, how can I still be consistent? It's why I even love when clients come into coaching or a program during the wrong time to start, where life is trying to throw everything at them during the summer, during the holidays, not just in January, because so often we go to try and make habit changes in January and make them based on this perfect time of year. It's time where we're not traveling, we're not having other things get in the way. And then we make all these habit changes that aren't really realistic for our actual lifestyle. They're just realistic for this bubble we're in right then. Versus when we make changes during the summer, during the holidays, we're making improvements off of that time of year, which is often the hardest for us. And those habits are going to be ones we can be consistent with, even when life isn't going our way. And when we can be consistent with something when we're not motivated, that's when it becomes a true habit and routine. That's where discipline is built and we're not relying on willpower. And then we can build off of that. And the more you do, the more you do. When you create that success mindset where you're feeling like you're making those habit changes and you're seeing results build, you want to do more. So just remember, you're not always going to be motivated. If you're trying to rely on willpower, if you're trying to rely on motivation, if you're trying to only start stuff when things are good, you are not going to be able to be consistent with that. And embrace doing the minimum. I know we say, oh, I'm an all or nothing person. Okay, well, that's an excuse. I say that having made that excuse for a very long time, but that's an excuse. That's an excuse to not still do something and let ourselves off the hook when we don't want to do anything. And instead of those times, you have to have that motivation and discipline to still do something consistently. And I do say motivation there because I think sometimes motivation is a pride in I've been consistent with this so far. I've done this. Like even stepping back to say, I'm motivated to do this, not because I actually have motivation, but because I take pride in knowing that I'm pushing through the hard. And I think sometimes that recognition, hey, this is a hard point I've generally turned back from. This time I'm going to make a 1% change to push through. And even that step back to recognize this is a hard you have turned back at helps you reveal your own strength. It's like that workout that you really don't want to do, but you push through anyway. We're potentially a little bit more comfortable being uncomfortable in that way, which is why we can sometimes push through that hard, right? But you want to treat that same or have that same attitude with other habits as well. Hey, that workout I really don't want to do. I know if I just do it, I'm going to feel extra good. Well, the same is going to go for your macros. The same is going to go for sticking with your plan when you're, out with the girls on a Friday night or whatever else. Sometimes you have to push that hard and recognize you're going to feel all that much better for it. Which brings me to the last habit, which is assess what truly is a sacrifice. So often we feel restricted. We go, I feel like that person on the diet. I don't want to do this. And we're falling back into old patterns and routines that don't really serve us without truly assessing, is this really a sacrifice for me right now? Do I even really enjoy this? Because a lot of times it's just that we've always done it. And so we feel like, I don't get to do what I've always done. But we're not necessarily saying, is this something I really want to do? Is this something I really enjoy? Or am I just doing it because it's something I've always done because of a fear of judgment from other people or a fear of judgment from yourself? And I think with that too, recognizing, hey, yeah, okay, this is a sacrifice. Maybe in the future I do want to do that. But this is my choice right now to make a habit change and move forward towards my goal. Because I think sometimes even placing sacrifices in the grander scheme of things, recognizing that, hey, this is a choice that I am making right now for a specific goal. And at some other point, as my goals evolve and I shift maybe into maintenance or towards muscle gains or towards a performance goal or maybe fat loss, I can make a different choice. But assess what is truly a sacrifice over getting caught up in what you've always done and the fact that this is different. Because I think often just something being different makes us feel this resistance against the change and it makes us feel like we're sacrificing things, when in reality, that thing isn't even that important to us. So just remember, if you want to see better fat loss results, especially from those stubborn areas, you can't out-exercise or out-diet time. You can't do more. And in trying to do more and rush the process, you ultimately often sabotage your own success. Instead, focus on those boring basics and dial things in, making tweaks to what you're already doing in terms of your nutrition, your workouts, your recovery, using these 5 tips. Thanks for listening to the Fitness Hacks podcast. Again, this is the place where I share all my free workout and nutrition tips. I'm never going to run sponsorships or ask you to buy anything. All I ask in return is if you're enjoying the podcast to leave a rating or review or share it with someone you think it might help. This will only take a few minutes, and it would mean the world to me and possibly change the life of someone you know.